What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. Should have a couple more videos up for you guys throughout the week as I continue to try to give you guys off-season coverage. I think I'm going to talk about the wide receiver unit possibly tomorrow. But in this video, I want to talk about the offensive line. And in my opinion, the most important unit in football as an overall unit is the offensive line. Everything stems from it. The running lanes, the wide receivers, having enough time to run their routes, the quarterback having enough time to throw the football. Everything stems from the offensive line. And this past year, I think we all know that the New York Giants clearly showed confidence in the unit that they built last year via the draft with with the three players that they drafted in rounds 1, 3, and 5. And it was kind of a surprise to a lot of members of the fan base. Not every fan in this fan base thought that the New York Giants were going to select the first-round lineman, but I think most of us expected one selected within the first 3 rounds. And yeah, I'm not going to lie to you, on draft day, I was expecting the New York Giants to at least provide some depth on that offensive line and some more young talent. After all, this offensive line was a major letdown last year. But in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the reasoning as to why the New York Giants may have elected to go that route and why, in the end, Dave Gettleman and Joe Judge could be proven right that this offensive line may be a lot better than people like me or even you who may be watching this video may think. Now, by no means am I coming out and saying that I expect this offensive line to be a great unit. By no means am I even telling you that I think it's going to be an average unit. I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see how it all plays out, but I definitely have a question going into the year about this offensive line, and any rational Giants fan should have a question. After all, this offensive line has been abysmal really over the last 10 years, and the New York Giants, that's been the major downfall. It's why we haven't been able to be consistent. We haven't had running lanes. We didn't give Eli Manning time, and so far, we haven't given Daniel Jones a whole lot of time. Some of that definitely falls on Jones. I don't want to make all of it fall on the offensive line, but the offensive line has been a major problem. But one major reason why is continuity, which is going to be one of my 5 major reasons, and we'll get to that in a second. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is to why this offensive line may be better than a lot of the pundits and the fans may think is the coaching change. But before we get into that, let's talk about the offensive line last year. Will Hernandez had a grade of 58.1. He allowed 1 sack at 525 snaps. I thought that Hernandez actually started to play better as the season progressed, and then he got COVID, and then he kind of fell out of the starting lineup. I still think he's at least an average guard in the NFL. We'll see if he gets a chance to start and whether or not it'll be on the left or the right side. Kevin Zeitler, who's now gone, had a grade of 65.9, which was actually the best mark of any guy that got, relevant snaps with the New York Giants on the line last year. I will say, though, he was definitely showing signs of regression. It was his lowest grade throughout the entirety of his career. The lowest mark before that was 74. He allowed 2 sacks and 1,003 snaps. Could be a major reason why the New York Giants elected to let him leave. They wanted to see these young players progress, and maybe they thought Zeitler was on the way down, and some of these young players were on the way up. Andrew Thomas had a grade of 62.4, which is pretty decent for a rookie left tackle. He did, however, allow 10 sacks, which I think was the most at that position in the NFL, over 978 snaps. He did get much better, though, over the second half of the season. We're going to talk more about that throughout this video. And he was dealing with an injury, which later came out at the end of the year to his foot. Shane Lemieux, in terms of his grade, was horrible, 32.2. I think we all know he was much better in terms of run blocking, and the running game started to get going once he got inserted into the lineup. Now, does that have to do with Judge and the coaching change for Mark Colombo, or does it have to do with Lemieux himself replacing Will Hernandez once he went out due to COVID? Could it have been a coincidence? Absolutely, but maybe Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman hit on a diamond in the rough, and maybe with more seasoning, he could become a good player. His pass blocking, to me, is still a major question mark. He allowed 5 sacks from the interior line position in just 504 snaps and only had a 16.9 grade in pass situations, allowing a pressure every 12 snaps. Nick Gates at the center spot struggled a little bit in the beginning, but he definitely started to get, it looked like, much more comfortable at that position. And I think I'm pretty confident with him going into next year at that position. He had a 59.7 grade, did not allow a sack in over 1,000 snaps at the center spot. And Matt Peart allowed 2 sacks and 150 snaps with a grade actually pretty solid of 69.7. He was used situationally, though. We'll see how he does when he has to play on an every down basis, if in fact he does get that starting right tackle position. But there's still definitely some major question marks. And we added Zach Fulton as well, who didn't have the best years last year either. But the first thing I want to talk about was the coaching change. Last year, we all know that, the offensive line coach, Mark Colombo, just didn't work out. First thing I'm going to say is Joe Judge, at least through 1 year, has proven when he gets the opportunity to bring in the guy of his choosing, they've exceeded expectations, right? You look at Patrick Graham, who was the main guy. He's the assistant head coach. He's the defensive coordinator. Going into last year, I don't think any of us thought at all that this defense was going to be even close to a top 10 defense. Well, if it wasn't top 10, it was damn close. And Patrick Graham has a lot to do with that, who was obviously handpicked from Joe Judge. Mark Colombo, I don't think you could say the same thing. He obviously had ties to the offensive coordinator with Jason Garrett coming over from the Cowboys. I don't think Garrett was a Joe Judge hire. I think it was definitely Giants influenced. Outside, he was really the only major coach that didn't have any ties to Joe Judge. So I think Colombo was kind of more of a Garrett guy than a Judge guy. And I think there's evidence towards that due to the fact that we fired the guy just halfway through the season, and him and Judge didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of things. And when Judge tried to step in, Colombo took offense to it. Sale's a guy that has worked with Judge in the past, that Judge clearly respects a lot when you read some of these quotes. And the one thing that you hear, not just from Judge, but from several people, the key word that I hear is he's a developer, a very good teacher, and a guy that has shown in the past that he's very good at molding the minds of young offensive linemen. So I think that is the first reason as to why this offensive line may be a lot better than some people may think. The new coaching change with Rob Sale and what he could bring to this unit. This is what Judge had to say about him. Rob is an excellent teacher. He's a great high-energy coach and very detailed on the field. His guys respond to him, Judge said. I've watched him develop a number of players at different places, whether he was at Georgia, Arizona State, Louisiana. I've watched him develop a number of offensive linemen that have been successful. In Louisiana last year, one of the best rushing attacks in the country behind that offensive line. And in 2020, they actually had two offensive linemen drafted in the NFL draft, one in the second round and one in the fourth. And this is how they fared. Hunt and Dotson combined for 15 starts in 29 games that they played in 2020. Hunt finished with a better PFF run blocking grade than 2020 first-rounders Jedrick Wills and Tristan Wirfs, who made the Pro Football Writers of America All-Rookie team. While Dotson landed ahead of veterans Kevin Zeitler and David DeCastro in overall PFF grades for guards. Simply, Sale has proven he knows how to produce pro-ready linemen. And like I said, with the evidence that we've seen with Patrick Graham last year and what he was able to do with this defense, maybe a guy like Rob Sale, who's a very smart mind, who Joe Judge believes in, could get a lot more out of this offensive line than the previous regime. So I think that is the first big key as to why this offensive line may be better than some may think. Second thing I wanted to bring up was continuity. I think continuity outside of the coaching staff is perhaps the most important thing on an offensive line. I don't think it's necessarily talent. Now, of course, talent's always going to help. When you could get an all-world lineman like a guy like Quentin Nelson, for example, he obviously did a lot for that Colts offensive line. But I think continuity and coaching has a lot to do with it. And the New York Giants have not really had continuity on this offensive line when you go back and look at it since 2011. And I'm going to go over the lineups over the course of the last 8 years or so, and really you get to see how little continuity this unit has had since then. And that has a lot to do with it. And this year, for the first time in a long time, there should be a lot of continuity. Now, of course, last year, Fleming played a bit, but what Judge did throughout the year, because I think he knew that these young guys were going to have a much bigger role going into this year, is he played musical chairs. He got guys in the lineup. These guys have practiced together as well in the practice field. And this year, you're going to have Matt Peart in an expanded role. He has experience with these linemen. Of course, you have Andrew Thomas, who I think we all know is going to be on the left side. Gates will be in the center spot. Hernandez has been with this line now for a number of years. And Shane Lemieux, you have to figure, at least has a good opportunity to start. Maybe Fulton gets the initial job on the right side. But regardless, four guys who played together last year will be playing with one another again. And I think the New York Giants are trying to build continuity. I think that goes a long way. You look at those great offensive lines that the New York Giants had, not all of those guys were high draft picks. As a matter of fact, I don't think any of them were first-round draft picks. And if you go back to the 2007 Giants offensive line, the team that ended up winning the Super Bowl, the offensive line was David Deal on the left side, Rich Seubert, Sean O'Hara, Chris Nee, and Kareem McKenzie. In the 2008, you had the same exact offensive line. In 2009, you guessed it, the same exact offensive line. None of those guys moved out of any position. In 2009, it was the same line minus O'Hara. O'Hara, I think, retired. And then in 2011, they added David Boss to be the starting center. And then O'Hara retired. But it was really the same offensive line from 2007 to 2011, minus one or two pieces there in that last year. Continuity. And that's why that offensive line got the job done. Since then, this offensive line has been nowhere near together in terms of bringing the same guys back, putting them in the same roles. When you look at it, in 2012, we had Will Beatty, we had Kevin Booth, we had David Boss, we had Chris Nee, and David Deal. The next year, you had Beatty, Booth, and Deal back with Pugh and Jim Cordell who I don't even remember, was the starting center in 2013 or the guy that got the most reps. Then the next year, you had Will Beatty back yet again. You had Justin Pugh on the right side again. So you had two pieces. And outside of that, you had J.D. Walton at the center. You had Richburg at the guard. And you had John Jerry. The following year, you had a completely new offensive line. You had a rookie in Eric Flowers. They moved Pugh to the guard spot, which is where he actually played better. Richburg moved from the guard to the center. You had Jeff Schwartz, and you had Marshall Newhouse. The following year, you brought Flowers back on the left side. You brought Pugh back at the guard, and you brought Richburg back at the center. So you had three pieces of continuity, and then you had John Jerry and Bobby Hart. The year after that, you only had one piece of continuity, which sucked. Eric Flowers remained on the left side. John Jerry moved to the other guard. You had Brett Jones at the center. You had John Halapio, and you had Justin Pugh back at the tackle. And then finally in 2018, Dave Gettleman's first year, you had a brand new offensive line again. You had Nate Solder, Will Hernandez, Spencer Pulley, Jamon Brown, and Chad Wheeler. The following year, you brought back just Solder and Hernandez on the left side. Halapio, Zeitler, and Remmers were all new. And then this past year, the only guy that was back in the same spot was Zeitler. You had Thomas, Lemieux, Gates, and Fleming. So we have had no continuity on that offensive line whatsoever. I think this year, you're going to have the same unit or close to the same unit back again, and you hope that they grow together, which is what great offensive lines do. So to me, that's the second key. For the first time in a long time, the New York Giants should have some familiarity on that offensive line, and they may perform a lot better than some people may think between the coaching change and between the continuity. The next thing I wanted to bring up in terms of a key for the New York Giants is the added weapons, and I think this is just common sense. Added weapons should help assist. It makes the offense less predictable, which in the end should help the offensive line. Teams aren't going to just pin their ears back and blitz on every possession. Last year when Saquon Barkley went down, when we had the wide receivers that we had, defenses knew we didn't have much to work with, so they sent the house pretty much on every play, it seemed like, especially as it got later into the season. And with Daniel Jones' immobility, I think it only added to that. You know, and we're going to get into the progress that this offensive line made throughout the year, but the offensive line for the year was not very good. But the fact that Barkley went down, the fact that Golden Tate was like our number one option, him or Darius Slayton, I mean, that had a lot to do with it. Now you bring a guy like Kenny Golladay that the defense has to respect. You bring in a guy like Kadarius Toney that should create quick separation. Evan Ingram, kind of in a reduced role, should get a better opportunity to create mismatches. The same can be said for Slayton. The same can be said for Shepard. And, of course, Saquon Barkley makes this offensive line better, in my opinion. Just the dynamic of him in the backfield and defenses having to account for these better weapons on the outside and in the backfield. So I think that's a major key as well as to why this offensive line may perform a lot better than some people may think. Next thing we're going to talk about is Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman's track record. Mainly Dave Gettleman, but Dave Gettleman throughout his career has built a reputation towards building the hog mollies. With the Giants, has it worked out? We'll see. They drafted 3 offensive linemen last year. I think you got to give him time. Solder didn't work out. Never blamed him for bringing him in, though. Hernandez, he's been somewhat disappointing, but with Carolina, Gettleman did a damn good job. Darrell Williams was a very good tackle that I think he got in the 5th or 6th round. And Trey Turner was the 3rd round pick that was a 5-time Pro Bowler. So I think Gettleman's track record for finding offensive linemen late and Joe Judge's coaching ability that he showed last year and his decision-making, I think brings more confidence that these two guys were confident in the 3 offensive linemen that they drafted last year to take a big step up going into year 2 of their careers. So that, to me, I'm a little bit more confident than I would have been, say, had Pat Shurmur still been the head coach for the New York Giants. And then the second half progression, I think that has to be taken into account last year, and just the second year progression, right? Younger players are usually going to have if they're going to be good, are usually going to have a much better leap than, say, a 4 or 5 year player. You're talking about rookies last year that learned. They were learning as they went. They were thrown into the fire. These guys playing together for another year, having more experience in the NFL, should only grow and get better going into their second year. But last year, the second half progression was clearly evident, especially after we fired Mark Colombo in the running game specifically. In terms of letting up sacks, well, I'll get into my reasoning as to why it was not better. As a matter of fact, it was worse, but I'll give my reasoning as to why I think that may be. But in terms of run blocking, I mean, just watching the games, it was blatantly obvious that we were much better at running the football in the second half. As a matter of fact, that became a strength of this football team. We were one of the better teams in terms of running the football in the second half of the season, and we didn't go up against cupcakes. The Seattle Seahawks, when we played them, if I remember correctly, I think had the best running defense in football. If they weren't the best, they were top 3 or 4 going into that game. The New York Giants ran for 190 yards on them, and that was without having any threat in the passing game. And the offensive line, in terms of run blocking, had a lot to do with it. Over the first half last year, the New York Giants only ran for 788 yards, which is under 100 yards a game, just under, figure about 95 yards a game. And 316 of the 788 yards came from Daniel Jones himself. That means only 472 yards came from the running back positions or jet sweeps to Evan Ingram for the most part, which is nothing. You're talking about 60 yards a game outside of the quarterback position. Jones was the leading rusher, if I'm not mistaken, over the first 8 games of the year. Then in the second 8 games, when Joe Judge stepped in and these offensive linemen got more familiarity with one another, you started to see them take a big leg up. Over the last 8 games, in comparison to the first, they rushed for almost 200 yards more. They had 980 yards on the ground as opposed to 788, and only 107 yards came from Daniel Jones himself, part of the reason being due to the fact that he was hurt. So 873 yards, or 401 more yards in the same amount of games over the second half, came from the running back position. So the offensive line got much better in terms of run blocking. It's not like we had these otherworldly backs that were back there. Wayne Gallman is a decent back who performed well, and I think a lot of it had to do with the progression in terms of the coaching change and just the progression of these young players learning to play with one another in terms of run blocking. Now, the pass protection left a lot to be desired in both halves of the season. The second half was actually worse. In the first half, the New York Giants allowed 23 sacks and 273 pass attempts, or 8.4% of the quarterback's dropbacks or pass attempts, or whatever however you want to measure it. In the second half, in 29 less pass attempts, they only threw 244 times as opposed to 273. They allowed 4 more sacks. They allowed 27 sacks in the second half, or 11% of the quarterback's pass attempts they allowed a sack, which is a ridiculously high number. Now, what is some of the reasoning behind that? Well, one, I think the musical chairs had a lot to do with it. As the season went along, you started to see Joe Judge bring guys in and bring guys out as he was trying to get them to learn on the fly. I think trying to set them up for this year. But I think another major reason was the lack of mobility from Daniel Jones, right? Daniel Jones came back from the injury, which Joe Judge has come out and said that the injury was even worse than it may have initially been perceived by the media and the fans. He came out and said that about a week ago, and we all saw it. Daniel Jones couldn't move, especially in that Cardinals game where we let up 8 sacks. Now, some of that definitely had to do with Matt Peart and Andrew Thomas getting beat, but I think the lack of mobility and the musical chairs and Daniel Jones not being able to move around definitely assisted in that. If you take that game out, it's only 19 sacks over 7 games, which is still bad, but it's kind of on par with the first half. So I think Jones's lack of mobility, I think the musical chairs definitely assisted in that, and I think there's reasons to believe that the New York Giants offensive line will be much better this year. Now, what does much better mean? Because last year we ranked like 31st, according to PFF, of any offensive line in the NFL. And I mean, however you want to measure it, we let up the second most sacks. We weren't good, but we got better over the course of the season. So, to me, significantly better, maybe top 20, maybe top 18, close to league average. And if the New York Giants are close to league average because of all the factors that I've said in terms of the blocking department, whether it be the better weapons, whether it be more continuity, whether it be the new offensive line coach, this New York Giants offense is going to be a hell of a lot better. But it's going to come down to that offensive line, and I'm trying to go in with an optimistic approach, and I'm going to try to trust Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman with their evaluations of this unit, because quite frankly, we don't have much of a choice. Hopefully it all works out. I believe it could. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.